The anniversary party was Maria's idea. That's what made it so surprising. For years, she had shied away from celebrations, always claiming she didn't like being the center of attention. But as their fifth wedding anniversary approached, Maria insisted on hosting a small gathering. Kelechi deserves it, she said when her mother asked why she suddenly wanted to celebrate. 5 years is no small thing. It wasn't a big party, just close family and friends. Kelechi was thrilled. He thought it was a sign that Maria was trying to mend things between them, to bridge the growing distance in their marriage. She's turning a corner, Kelechi told me the day before the party. I think this is a good sign. I smiled and nodded, but something about the way Maria had been acting didn't sit right with me. She had been too calm lately, too composed. It wasn't like her. When Maria mentioned inviting Uncle Nduka, everyone was taken aback. Nduka, her mother repeated, frowning. Are you sure? I thought you didn't like him much. Maria shrugged, her face unreadable. He's family, isn't he? It's time to let go of old grudges. Kelechi was delighted. That's the Maria I fell in love with, he said, kissing her cheek. You're finally opening up. If anyone noticed the way Maria stiffened at his touch, they didn't say anything. The party was held at their home, a modest but comfortable bungalow in the heart of Enugu. Maria had spent the whole day cooking, preparing jollof rice, fried plantains, egusi soup, and pepper chicken. She even baked a cake, though she wasn't much of a baker. Guests arrived in the early evening, filling the house with laughter and music. Maria moved through the crowd like a perfect hostess, smiling and chatting with everyone. When Uncle Nduka arrived, Kelechi greeted him warmly, clapping him on the back and pulling him into a hug. It's been too long, Uncle, Kelechi said, leading him inside. You're looking good. Nduka laughed, the same booming laugh Maria remembered from her childhood. He looked older with a bit of gray in his hair, but his eyes were just as sharp, just as calculating. Maria, Nduka said, turning to her. You've grown into such a beautiful woman. It's good to see you again. Maria smiled, though it didn't reach her eyes. Welcome, Uncle. I'm glad you could make it. Nduka beamed, oblivious to the tension in her voice. As the evening went on, everyone praised Maria for her cooking and her effort to bring the family together. This is wonderful, Kelechi said, pulling her aside at one point. Thank you for doing this. Maria nodded, her expression softening for a moment. You deserve it, she said quietly. Kelechi kissed her forehead, and for a brief moment, Maria allowed herself to lean into him. But then she saw Nduka across the room, laughing with some of the guests, and her stomach churned. She excused herself and went to the kitchen, gripping the counter to steady herself. Maria had spent weeks preparing for this night. She had waited years for this moment. She had spent countless nights lying awake, replaying the horrors of her childhood, the threats, the shame, the silence. She had tried to bury it, to lock it away, but it always found a way to claw itself back to the surface. When she saw Nduka at the funeral months earlier, something in her snapped. He was older, grayer, but still the same man. The same predator. Maria knew then that she couldn't keep living like this. She couldn't keep carrying the weight of what he had done to her. She had to do something. By the time the party wound down, it was late. Guests began trickling out, thanking Maria and Kelechi for a wonderful evening. Uncle Nduka, as usual, was among the last to leave. Except this time, he wasn't leaving. You can stay the night, Kelechi had said earlier. It's too late to travel. Maria had insisted on preparing the guest room for him. She even laid out fresh towels and a blanket, acting like the perfect hostess. When Kelechi kissed her goodnight and went to bed, Maria stayed up, cleaning the kitchen and tidying up the living room. But her eyes kept drifting toward the hallway, toward the guest room where Nduka was staying. When the house was silent, Maria picked up the knife. Nduka was asleep when Maria entered the room. He was sprawled out on the bed, snoring lightly, completely unaware of the storm that was about to descend on him. Maria stood in the doorway, gripping the knife so tightly her knuckles turned white. Her heart pounded, but her mind was clear. She stepped closer, the floorboards creaking softly under her weight. Nduka stirred but didn't wake. For a moment, Maria hesitated. The memories of what he had done to her came flooding back. The fear, the pain, the helplessness. But this time, she wasn't a scared little girl. She was in control now. Maria raised the knife. The scream tore through the house, waking Kelechi and sending him running toward the guest room. When he burst through the door, he found Maria standing over Nduka, the knife in her hand, blood dripping onto the floor. "What have you done?" Kelechi shouted, his voice shaking. Maria turned to look at him, her face calm, almost serene. "He can't hurt anyone else now," she said quietly. The scream was so loud it seemed to shake the walls. Kelechi froze in bed, his heart racing as the sound pierced through the stillness of the night. It took him a moment to gather himself, to realize where it was coming from. The guest room. He ran down the hallway, his bare feet slapping against the floor. When he reached the doorway, the sight stopped him dead in his tracks. Uncle Nduka was on the bed, writhing in pain, his hands pressed against a blood-soaked towel that had once been his salvation. His screams were animalistic, raw, as if they came from the deepest part of his soul. And then there was Maria. She stood at the foot of the bed, the knife dangling loosely in her hand. Blood dripped from the blade onto the floor. Her face was a mask of calm, her expression eerily blank. "Well, what did you do?" Kelechi whispered, his voice trembling. Maria turned to look at him, her eyes unflinching. "I stopped him," she said simply. The house erupted into chaos. Kelechi stumbled into the room, grabbing at the blood-soaked towel in a desperate attempt to stop the bleeding. Nduka's screams turned into guttural moans as he lost strength, his face pale and sweat-covered. "Call an ambulance!" Kelechi yelled, his voice cracking. "Someone call for help." I grabbed my phone from the living room and dialed. My hands were shaking so badly that I almost dropped it. The operator's calm voice felt surreal as I tried to explain what had happened. "Please hurry," I said, glancing toward the hallway. There's a lot of blood." When I returned to the guest room, Kelechi was still pressing down on Nduka's wound, his face streaked with tears. Maria hadn't moved. She stood in the corner, holding the knife as if she were in a trance. By the time the ambulance arrived, so had the police. The first officer on the scene, a tall man with a stern expression, took one look at the scene and shook his head. "What happened here?" he demanded, his voice sharp. She cut him," Kelechi stammered, pointing at Maria. "I don't know why. She just—" "Step back, sir," the officer said, pulling Kelechi away from the bed. Two paramedics rushed in, immediately working to stabilize Nduka. One of them muttered something under his breath about the severity of the injury. Meanwhile, another officer approached Maria. "Ma'am, put the knife down," he said firmly. Maria didn't resist. She let the knife fall from her hand, the clang of metal on the floor echoing through the room. "Turn around," the officer said, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. Maria obeyed, her movements slow and deliberate. As the officer cuffed her hands behind her back, she glanced at Kelechi. "He hurt me," she said quietly. Kelechi stared at her, his face a mix of confusion, anger, and heartbreak. "What are you talking about?" he asked. "Nduka? What did he do to you?" But Maria didn't answer. At the police station, Maria sat across from two detectives in a small, dimly lit room. She didn't look scared or nervous. She looked tired. "Do you want a lawyer?" one of the detectives asked, his tone neutral. Maria shook her head. "I don't need one. I'll tell you everything." The detectives exchanged a glance. "All right," the first one said, flipping open his notebook. "Let's start with this. Why did you attack your husband's uncle?" Maria took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly as they rested on the table. For the first time in years, she let the truth spill out. She told them everything. About Nduka's arrival when she was 7, about the nights he crept into her room, about the threats he made to keep her silent. She described the years of fear, the sleepless nights, the way his presence at family gatherings made her skin crawl. "And you never told anyone about this?" the second detective asked, his voice softer now. Maria shook her head. "He said he'd kill me if I did." I believed him. The room fell silent. "And tonight," the first detective prompted. "What made you decide to act tonight?" Maria looked up, her eyes glassy. "Because I couldn't carry it anymore. Because I wanted to stop him before he could hurt anyone else." While Maria sat in the police station, Kelechi was pacing the living room, his hands in his hair. She's never been violent, he kept saying. She's never done anything like this before. I sat on the couch, watching him. I wanted to comfort him, but I didn't know what to say. She said he hurt her, Kelechi said suddenly, stopping in his tracks. What does that mean? What could he have done? I hesitated. Part of me wanted to tell him that it was obvious, that he had to know deep down. But another part of me didn't want to speak the words out loud. I think she's been holding something in for a long time, I said carefully. Kelechi shook his head. Why wouldn't she tell me? I'm her husband. Why wouldn't she trust me with this? Because she was afraid, I wanted to say. Because she thought you wouldn't believe her. The news spread quickly. By the next morning, everyone in the neighborhood was talking about what Maria had done. Did you hear? One neighbor whispered to another. She attacked her husband's uncle in his sleep. Nearly killed him. What could he have done to deserve that? Someone else asked. Maybe she's possessed, an older woman muttered. Or it's juju. There's no other explanation. But as more details emerged about Maria's confession, about what she said Nduka had done to her, the whispers turned to debates. Good for her, one young woman said. Men like that deserve what they get. But she should have gone to the police, an older man argued. You can't take the law into your own hands. In the hospital, Nduka underwent emergency surgery. The doctors managed to save his life, but they couldn't undo the damage Maria had done. He would never fully recover, physically or otherwise. When the police tried to question him about Maria's accusations, he denied everything. She's lying, he insisted. She's crazy. Why would I do something like that? But the look in his eyes told a different story. Maria's trial was the talk of the town. Everyone had an opinion about what she had done. Some called her a hero, others a criminal. The courtroom was packed every day, with reporters and curious onlookers eager to see how the story would end. The prosecution painted Maria as a cold, calculating woman who had committed a premeditated act of violence. There are laws for dealing with grievances, the prosecutor said, pacing the courtroom. What Maria Ease did was not justice. It was revenge. The defense, however, focused on Maria's trauma. Her lawyer argued that years of abuse and silence had pushed her to the breaking point. This was not an act of malice, the defense attorney said, her voice firm. This was an act of desperation, committed by a woman who had been failed by those around her. Maria herself took the stand. I was 7 years old when it started, she began, her voice steady but quiet. Uncle Nduka was supposed to protect me, but he hurt me in ways I can't even begin to describe. I carried that pain for years, thinking no one would believe me. When I saw him again, I realized I couldn't live with that fear anymore. The courtroom fell silent as Maria described the nights she spent awake, terrified, and the years she spent hiding her pain. I didn't want to hurt anyone, she said, her voice breaking. I just wanted it to stop. After weeks of testimony and deliberation, the jury reached a verdict. Maria was found guilty of aggravated assault, but was given a reduced sentence due to the mitigating circumstances of her trauma. She was sentenced to 5 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 3. When the judge read the sentence, Maria didn't cry. She simply nodded, as if she had already made peace with the outcome. Kelechi struggled with what had happened. The woman he loved, the woman he had promised to stand by, was now a convicted criminal. But he also couldn't ignore the pain in her eyes when she spoke about Nduka. She must have been so scared, he said one evening, sitting across from me at the dining table. All those years, and I didn't even see it. You couldn't have known, I said gently. But I should have, Kelechi replied, his voice heavy with guilt. I should have done more to make her feel safe. For weeks, Kelechi debated whether to stay married to Maria. His family urged him to file for divorce, saying her actions had brought shame to their name. But Kelechi couldn't bring himself to leave her. She's still my wife, he said finally. She needs me now more than ever. Prison was both a punishment and a refuge for Maria. For the first time in years, she didn't have to pretend. She didn't have to smile when she didn't feel like it, or explain why she didn't want to be touched. She spent most of her days reading and writing letters to Kelechi. In one letter, she wrote, I know I've hurt you. I know you might never look at me the same way again. But I want you to know that everything I did because I couldn't carry the weight anymore. I hope someday you can forgive me, Kalechi wrote back every week, telling her about life at home, about how the garden she planted was still blooming, about how much he missed her. Back in the community, opinions about Maria's actions remained divided. Some people admired her courage. She did what the law couldn't, one neighbor said. Men like Nduka deserve to be punished. Others condemned her. She's a danger to society, another argued. What if she snaps again? The gossip eventually died down, but the story lingered, a cautionary tale that parents whispered to their children. Uncle Nduka's life was never the same after that night. He withdrew from the family, avoiding gatherings and refusing to speak about what had happened. His health deteriorated over time, both physically and mentally. He became a shadow of the man he once was, haunted by what Maria had exposed. Though he never admitted to what he had done, his silence spoke volumes. 3 years later, Maria was released on parole. Kalechi was waiting for her outside the prison gates, holding a bouquet of yellow roses, her favorite. When she saw him, she hesitated, unsure if he would still want her after everything that had happened. But Kalechi stepped forward and pulled her into a hug. "You're home now," he said softly. Maria broke down in his arms, the weight of the past 3 years finally lifting. Life after prison wasn't easy, but Maria was determined to move forward. She started attending therapy, something she had never considered before. It was there that she began to unpack her trauma, to understand how it had shaped her and how she could start to heal. She also began volunteering at a local shelter for abused women, sharing her story with those who felt trapped and powerless. "It doesn't have to end in silence," she told them. "You're stronger than you think." Maria and Kalechi worked to rebuild their marriage, one step at a time. It wasn't perfect, and there were days when the weight of what had happened threatened to pull them apart. But they held on to each other, determined to create a life that wasn't defined by the past. One evening, as they sat in their garden, Maria looked up at the sky and smiled. For the first time in a long time, she said, "I feel free." Kalechi reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "You deserve to be,"